I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source in Saratoga, New York, with the soulful American believer, Marilynne Robinson, prize novelist and teacher of novelists. You're known over the decades, Marilynne, as the storyteller we trust to observe the troubled heart of our country, our own troubled hearts. You've been a voice of encouragement. Somebody said, a voice that has been overheard by more readers than any other living American writer. This summer, you crossed a line. You've relabeled the American condition in Trump time. Our politics and our culture, you write, are under occupation by a faction of our fellow citizens. And it's quite unlike your normal, ordinary right to left or left to right political shift. It is not what people mean by polarization. It's something quite different, more like a hostile takeover with the feeling of regime change almost, maybe even a cultural revolution. Cross the line into that zone. And that word, occupation, strong word.
In the traditional way of talking about the country as polarized implies that if we just compromised, if we could find intermediate places where we could make acceptable adjustments to each other's preferences and so on. But that is not how things are now. The position of the people in charge of the red side of things is so alien to American tradition that it's really a change of character in the country, as if someone had come from the outside, from the philosophical outside, say, and simply erased a great deal that has accumulated as the character of the country and the genius of the country over time. You look at the policies now, and what I agree was reasonable to reduce food support for children by half. Would that be an acceptable compromise position?
Yeah. Would that be on your list? I don't think so.
No. Would I be willing to cut cancer research by half? No. We have passed out of a conversation where it seemed as if certain kinds of mutual adjustments were possible into a situation where things that violate essential aspects of American history and life, and by that I mean enormously generous and ambitious medical research, for example.
Yep.
These are very characteristic expressions of what Americans have hoped for from their existence as a society. And to brutalize them, to simply erase away 50% or 80% of a policy that's been meticulously developed over generations. It's not polarization. It is a rejection of basic constructive elements of American life.
Donald Trump's siege of Los Angeles emerged almost precisely in time to affirm your image of the occupation of our country.
We're not in cahoots, I can promise you.
Is that what it means to be occupied?
Well, it's certainly a foretaste, I would say. And just dismissing the governor, if he had no role in whether or not the National Guard would be used, and pretty ominous, I would say.
Since you introduced that word, it's gained a sort of purpose. You write in that marvelous article, it feels written in a sort of a fury of breakthrough understanding in the New York Review of Books. You wrote, a well-planned occupation seizes the heights of the defeated civilization so that people will see their leaders ousted or humiliated and made docile. It will likewise discredit and weaken those features of the culture in which people placed confidence and pride. If this model were applied to our situation, we might expect to see the Supreme Court diminished, the Congress disempowered, and the Constitution desacralized by indifference or contempt, the purpose being to undermine the viability of popular government, the repute, the function. Can they have thought of all that?
I think that there is an actual active ideological interest now in being post-democratic. I think that there are sort of elitist theories now that are associated with absurdities like IQs and so on, It's as if there's a diminishing world in terms of wealth and possibility and so on, and that this smaller pie has to be divided among fewer people, partly in order to enable them to go to Mars or whatever they take to be, the next step beyond democracy.
In fairness, they didn't invade the country militarily, and they didn't win the election at the point of a gun. I mean, Donald Trump won Iowa last year by 13 percentage points, which is a lot, a landslide. Can you imagine a democratic remedy for this crisis in democracy, in the theory and practice of popular self-government? And what if the name of the remedy is Zoran Mamdani?
If he's a remedy, sign me up.
How can it be that this overwhelmingly popular, young, fresh face, clean record is hands down the big news out of the New York City mayor's race, and the anti-Democrats are running the country and the
Well,
culture?
it's a huge country with pockets of culturally different populations. I grew up in Idaho, which is really quite far from everywhere, at least, psychologically. And it's different. People think differently, and they have different ethnicities that are the story behind them. They have different religions, varieties always of Christianity, but still, we're, United States. The name signifies the fact that we are separate states,
various,
who choose to act as a single organism to the extent that they can.
Distinguish, Marilynne Robinson, I'm quoting you here, these people who call themselves conservative are root and branch radicals. So it is time to face the fact that their demolition of government and society, as we have known them, more strongly resembles a hostile occupation than a normal presidency. From there, distinguish, if you can, the fundamental emotional, theoretical, almost theological differences between the Reds and the Blues. The Blues seem to take, and you say, a generous view of American institutions. The Reds are angry about the authority that the Blues have claimed for themselves. The Blues speak for the tax-exempt world. They're purposeful, in a way, for the generality. They stand for medicine, medical care, medical innovation. They stand for, especially for education. And that's why they have tax-exempt status. They're doing something purposeful for the world. But the Reds are hung up on the cultural status and power and authority that all that doing good has given the Blues.
Yeah. One of the things that's characteristic of the Red side is they feel as if someone else cannot benefit except at their cost. You know what I mean? If, for example, you are taxed and you spend money on good public education, then the whole community prospers because having educated general public is an enormously wealth-creating thing. They see it as we buy privilege, we earn privilege, therefore other people have to do relatively less well in order for us to be appropriately rewarded for doing well, for prospering. The distributive impulse behind trying to make good public institutions of various kinds, which enriches everyone, this is resented by people who use words like socialist and communist to talk about the fact that it is easily demonstrated that societies that are generous among themselves as groups prosper. I think that the shift of wealth into regions that were not part of the development of this sort of culture of public responsibility and so on, it created political power and cultural power and everything else, as money does,
Are you thinking of a place in particular?
You
Texas?
Yeah.
Southern California?
Yes, frankly, I'm closer to that and less well aware of it. But yes, the big states that are politically or economically influential now are places that have thriven as technological centers and so on only in the last few decades, I mean, before that, they were extractive economies like for oil and so on.
People I know love to reread your Gilead series of novels. I'm among them, not least for the reassurance that breathes all through them. I mean, they're novels about families of preachers in rural Iowa in the 20th century. And we read them not least for a certain reassurance about the biblical goodness of this country. You're full of it. Goodness over centuries. And even now, it's a family place with moral understanding and even rules, but it's fixed on redemption. And not sentimentally, it's fixed on the soul of this country. Lead us into some of those families and how they personify parts of this revolution. And they're, of course, entangled in my mind with the way you look at everything.
It is sort of how I look at everything, and that makes me a kind of poor observer, I'm too close to me. I became interested specifically in Iowa because I went there to teach, and I realized that I didn't understand the landscape because there are things that are remarkable about it. Like very often the oldest structure on the landscape is a college or a church, or a college and church more typically. And the reason for that is because people went out from places like Yale and Andover and Amherst and so on, people that were, men who were just before ordination or newly ordained as ministers. And their purpose was to make it so that the culture of the Middle West would not accept slavery. That was
Right.
the great issue of the time.
Right.
And so they culturally created a region of the country that would be resistant to slavery. And they did that with religion and with education. And with great effect. I mean, over time, the Middle West became the best educated part of the country. In any case, they were very active in the Underground Railroad. A tremendous number of their young people went into the Union Army, sustained
Right.
it when New York and so on began to sort of drift away. A great deal of that culture is left, and a great deal of that history is forgotten. I think that's sort of true of this country in general. Like listening to this talk about death penalty, there was a time when, for example, the state of Kansas would not allow an execution in Kansas, even though the execution would have been at Leavenworth, which was federal. They raised such a ruckus that the federal government backed off of executing anyone within Kansas. Michigan was the first political entity in the world to ban the death penalty entirely. There was a time earlier in this country when what you would think of as very enlightened programs were assumed, were the law. And then this second, like post Reconstruction period came in where it was as if the American thing were to do the hard, benighted thing, which is sort of what you have now. That assumption that, well, Americans just kill people, Americans just have guns, Americans just, when many of those things were civilized away, in the earlier 19th into the early 20th century. We forget the best aspects of our history.
You'd like to quote U.S. Grant, General and President, calling Iowa the radical heart of America.
Yes, exactly. The shining star of radicalism. Right.
Right.
Yeah. All sorts of things became legal in Iowa and in the rest of the Middle West before anywhere else, like women's suffrage and so on,
And integrated public schools.
Yes, exactly. And, there were integrated towns and schools and so on in the 1830s in places like Illinois and Ohio and Iowa. How can we forget that? When I was in, high school and college, they were just then integrating schools. And it was as if it had never been thought of and never been done. And here were colleges still standing, like Oberlin and, that whole flock of abolitionist schools that had a history of educating Black students right along with everybody else.
What does that tell you in the end? Is it that every kind of social institution has a life and a season and is gone? Or simply we know the rules somewhere in our psychic history and memory, and of course we can get them back?
I think we would be a healthier country if we could remember the positive achievements of other generations. And I'm not saying, it's okay to have Confederate generals standing in the public park or something. I mean, remembering that the North constructed society in the hope of excluding slavery. They talk about the work ethic, but it was very intentional in these colleges where you paid for your tuition by doing work for the college, which meant slaughtering hogs and so on. You eliminated the idea of servo labor, in effect, by having everyone take on labor themselves, by honoring it, What a good idea. And those were very good colleges, still are. Knox and Grinnell and all these.
Is that one way to define the big difference then? That the Blues are people, by and large, who stand by the purpose of building a different sort of country, and the others who think it's uppity or a little too good to be true or too expensive or don't bother. And there you have the battle.
I don't claim to understand it, except that I think that the antagonism that has been built up, you can find Donald Trump saying these are people that hate our country, talking about people that have the loyalties that I have, which would be to the great institutions of American civilization, But, you can find people from that side saying that we are demons, this kind of language. I mean, now apparently there are people that think that we changed the weather in order to create this terrible affliction for Texas. It's not rational. It doesn't suggest a kind of hands-on experience of how the world works. It's like some sort of fantasy of, but nevertheless, it's very highly excited.
Yeah.
And has quasi-religious overtones.
We got to get to the religious because you write about it so persistently and so well. I wanted just to mention though that people get excited on the Blue State side too. Tressie McMillan Cottom is a very interesting writer, a lot like you in many respects. She's a black woman, teaches in North Carolina, sociologist, terrific writer. She posted the other day that she's in despair about ever seeing her country again, the United States. And she says, I'm preparing myself to die under this American regime. And she gets terrific response, comments in despair from people who agree, but who worry about their kids desperately and their own medical care. One woman wrote on her site, the healthcare window is closing.
Yeah.
You shudder, but there's some sense of truth in it.
I'm pretty well convinced of the ideological model that I think is behind this. I wrote a book on economics.
I missed that one.
Yeah, it's called Mother Country. But in any case, if you read around in the world of economic thought, which is not especially pretty under the best circumstances, you find people saying too much money is spent on people who will not generate any wealth. So you should focus medical care on people that are young and educated or already prosperous and educated or something like that. This is basically British economics, the writers that are doing this. But the idea is the same, that there is a natural elite, that democracy has suppressed the gifted and the worthy, and that our economy is miscalculated because we focus money on people who need it rather than on people who will carry us to new heights of something or other, or at least make it easier to divide whatever is left of the world after it's been exploited into chaos.
Marilynne, do you imagine yourself in conversation or argument with MAGA voters? Where do you draw lines and where do you engage?
I have a very hard time engaging. I mean, because I can't understand people who are lovely, generous people in their own right, who nevertheless forgive Trump everything that he does. Sometimes it seems like a cult. I mean, there's a lot of rural poverty in Iowa. Will the MAGA governor allow a raise in the minimum wage? No. Every state around Iowa virtually has even double the minimum wage that Iowa has. If you don't pay people reasonably for their labor, either they leave or they remain because they have no options and they're very poor. The governor of Iowa and her legislature have done everything in the world to align themselves with Trump, with MAGA, and every bit of it is damaging to the rural poor, including things like taking money out of the public school system. People make bad choices. Maybe he's amusing to them. Maybe he's colorful. Maybe he seems like a magical man because he can go through so many bankruptcies without getting broke. You know, maybe his just audacity is pleasing to people who feel cornered or quieted in some way. I have no idea. But people have a history of voting for regrettable figures, and that is not hard to demonstrate.
Come back to Gilead for a moment, at least. I just read your last, I think, in that series of 4 marvelous novels about one town and really 2 families of ministers, the Ameses and the Botons. They're all friendly in a way. But the last one, Jack, is about a real screw-up in the Boton family. And he's a drinker and into drugs and misbehavior of every kind, almost from birth. And he leaves. But the hook is that he's a very lovable character. And he is, in your terms, in the old Iowa terms, thoroughly redeemable person. Nobody gives up on Jack. His father is always glad when he comes home. His sisters look out for him. And he himself aspires still. And I thought, is that where Marilynne Robinson sees the country now, as this sort of screw-up country and in a bit of a pickle, but still lovable and still thoroughly redeemable in what we can imagine as the Lord's eye, the Creator's eye? They're struggling down there in the U.S., but there's a magic about them.
I wish people would stop abusing Christianity. God may lose his patience, I think, soon. But in any case, as far as the character of Jack is concerned, I'm sort of interested in the idea of universal salvation. That's a much more pleasing idea to me than Judgment Day, that sort of thing. And I thought, if you made a negative character that you could not help loving, then God couldn't help loving him either, right?
Right?
Yeah, if there is anyone who can find a way to love anyone else, then that person has an indisputable merit from the point of view of having that sort of intrinsic value that comes with being lovable.
Everybody talks about the politics of this situation, but your gift is to talk about the underlying culture and the culture itself. I wonder, when you read as you do and even hear talk on the street, where do you pick up on the culture and the cultural occupation of our world in 2025? What are the hallmarks? I was saying to myself, the Jeff Bezos wedding in Venice might be a lasting image of the excess, the vulgarity, the incredible egomania of people in fashion today. But where do you see the culture being occupied, controlled?
Well, the policies of the government over and over again, like cutting off U.S. aid, and then a couple of days people spend saying how many hundreds of thousands of people will die as a consequence.
Right.
Lots and lots of people, many, many images of God. And then we go on, we pass on. And from my point of view, that's like we amputated a limb or something.
Yeah.
It seems to me so utterly out of character for Americans historically to simply cut people off like that and let their children die and let them die by the thousands and thousands. It's unbelievable to me that could happen. I think in a way it's so alien historically that a lot of people can't really believe that it actually happened.
I had a lot of those reactions looking at the pictures of the President of the United States inspecting the so-called alligator Alcatraz metal cages for human beings. Virtually all of them not having been formally charged or evidence brought against them. They've been rounded up and put in these machines, and he's bragging about it. Look what we did today.
Yeah.
We made these cages.
It's horrible. It's just horrible.
What spell were we put under, by whom, and how to accept that? It's not all that different from accepting day after month after year of seeing children in Gaza bombed by the most advanced technology that American money can pay for and build. But what is it that's caught us?
When I think about this, people have accepted the idea of America as a basically brutal civilization. I think that's true. I think it's partly a result of the incredibly horrible and misjudged Iraq War,
Yep.
and things like that have given that view some authority. But we don't talk about things that we have done well, that we don't know that we invented Social Security, for example, that was an innovation of American culture that the rest of the world picked up and so on. We don't realize what we have done in terms of education, these magnificent institutions all over the country, doing research of every possible kind, sustaining a level of intellectualism that has no parallel in the world, no parallel historically. I've made a kind of study of these things, and I've also taught in foreign universities. There's nothing like our university system.
I was going to say, it's the one big industry in this country that has no rival
Exactly.
in the world. It's where people go from all over the world, east and west, to learn.
And yet at the same time, you hear people say, well, Americans are not intellectual. Everything has to be dumbed down for the Americans or something like that. It simply doesn't compute. If we can sustain this high level of intellectual culture, we're pretty bright. And every feeder institution that sends people into these universities has to be doing pretty well. It's like a form of humility, except if you're going to be humble about something that is actually discreditable or ineffective. If it happens to be true that we've created an educational culture that is valuable to the whole world, which is true, then we ought to be able to say that as a statement of fact. And that would put us in a position of defending these institutions, which are so defenseless now when they're being attacked.
Come back to the word occupation. Somebody is doing this.
Yes.
And as you said, to humiliate the old owners of the culture. Can you identify people? We got to bring down Harvard. Here we have this thriving whole web of institutions, and they are the world's best by every account. Who said, no, we got to bring them down? J.D. Vance sort of says it, that
Yeah.
the disease of our culture is higher education.
Yes. I'd like to talk to Yale Law School and find out where some of these ideas are coming from, frankly. I think there are people who resent the fact that certain institutions or individuals from those institutions have more cultural authority than they have or have had up to this point. It feels like resentment to me. So much of it does. And I don't know what they're resenting. I mean, if you look at American society, take a tranche of it from any way you want to, we're among the most fortunate human beings that ever walked the earth.
And our generation too, if I may say.
Yes, exactly. And so here we are destroying an incomparable richness out of some kind of resentment that really very few of us have any right to at all.
Speak to the riddle that everybody poses is, how do we get it back? Is it redeemable? Is there salvation?
I mean, I think if there's a real peaceful popular rising beyond any scale of demonstration or anything we've seen to this point on any subject, we still have chance to change the government through elections. I think that one of the benefits that could come from all this is that we know now what we had. You know, the old song, you don't know what you have till it's gone, you know. We have seen what happens when you give the president immunity. We've seen what happens when instead of having balance of power, you have a completely servile Congress. We've seen these things. And if an election is mounted in a way so that you have people running on the privilege of being restrained in the presence of power, you know, people who want to restore a sense of the dignity of classically democratic culture, you know, for example, having a Supreme Court that seems to be interested in the Constitution and so on. I think we can rebuild it, but we better do it while there is still active memory of what the country was before this occupation began.
May I say, as a reader, it's one of the great charms for me of your writing. You are unshy about celebrating the virtues of this country and the blessedness of it, including the GI Bill and land-grant colleges and universities and the spirit of educating everybody, making everybody in this society virtually literate, on the track. And it gives more force, it seems to me, to your criticism. You're not a perpetual naysayer by any means.
No.
How do you call on that faith, so to speak, in a moment like this?
Growing up, you know, I did, in fact, grow up in the civil rights period. And I was always very interested, and I was reading the progressive ideas, you know, that came with that. What would the implications of some change be and all that sort of thing? It's as if I received my moral education from the debates and advances and so on that were made during that period, and the great speakers and the great transformations of people like Lyndon Johnson and so on, who could write a good civil rights law and so on. That was my education in a very deep sense. And I love that. I love the whole mentality of it. I can't separate myself from the very deep, deep affection I have for the idea of this as a reforming country that acknowledges difficulty and tries to deal with it, you know, and that has the courage to say, we have a great deal to share. We don't have to be worried about bearing burdens because we're very strong. I mean, this sort of resentful attitude that people have, why should we send food to people in another country? Because we can't, because they need it. Simple as that. It's that kind of America that did not resent and did not traduce and that saw its nature being expressed in a continuously larger and more generous interaction with its own people in the world.
Speak to the Mamdani point. We're all just getting to know this young man, but he's almost irresistible in his confidence, in his cleanness compared to sort of the assorted hack politicians of of New York City and state, but he's earnest. He appeals immensely to young people that had almost dropped out of politics in the thousands and thousands. He speaks like an angel. It turns out his father, whom I met 16 years ago and interviewed, is a scholar at Columbia University of post-colonial worlds, an Indian in Uganda, a man of immense learning. Young Mamdani's mother is Mira Nair, the filmmaker. He's, wall-to-wall privileged, and yet drawn in enthusiastically to the public's business. I find that almost a cure right there, and a bit of a miracle in this age to have this spirit emerge and catch fire.
Right.
In a hard-hearted old place like New York.
They're all very soft-hearted when you get past the surface, But, it's this sort of where your treasure is, there will your heart be also, There's no question, Trump, it's money. Trump, everything is about money or gold. Mamdani, it's civilization. That's where his treasure is. People make different kinds of sense depending on exactly that, where their treasure is. And we've lived for a long time with a kind of calculus that we're a little bit prone to, of thinking that wealth proves success, or is, synonym for success, or, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich, kind of thing. And this has become more and more exaggerated, more and more ridiculous. And somebody who can just step back and say, I'd like to live in a great city where people flourish and where they are not so encumbered with poverty that they can't create what they could create to the joy of us all. That's a much healthier, saner, more God-fearing notion of what is to be valued in life than any of this craziness about, gift airplanes and all this kind of stuff.
I wonder, are we taking this bewildering Trump moment seriously enough? We talk about it all the time, but have we plumbed the depths of it? Dare we?
Well, my theory about the elitist clique that sees actually, I think, I could be wrong, the lives of people who don't compute in terms of their idea of value as being redundant.
Spell that out.
Well, somebody who, for one reason or another, falls into the category of the poor.
You come at novel writing and at your whole worldview, Marilynne Robinson, with a theological interest, but also a historical understanding and a historical curiosity, a historical canon about where all this comes from. Going back, in our case, to the English Civil Wars, religious wars, which replicate themselves in fascinating ways in our own country.
Absolutely.
But speak about the longer historical context that you bring to bear on this moment.
Well,
including the Bible's frame of it and Shakespeare's framing of power.
I mean, it's amazing. We culturally are descended from a population that was very much harried and burned at the stake and that sort of thing. But it's, we don't talk about that. It's like, why did the Pilgrims come? Oh, they just like to ride around in boats or something. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Closer look at Plymouth Rock.
Exactly. In any case, growing out from under the downward pressure that was imposed on every population, that was very much a consequence for the accessibility of the Bible, which does not endorse that sort of thing.
You're a student of history, among other things. What's the long view, the millennial long view of these troubles today? How far back do you trace it to the Bible?
There's very little actual relationship between the problem that we have now and the problem we would have had 500 years ago. But there is a good similarity, I think, between the problem we have now and the problems we had in the 20th century. Like eugenics, the idea, again, of there being an elite, a ruling class that are justified in their claims by the accident of biology, becoming from superior stock or something like that, People talk about having droves of children in order to replenish the people that are the natural leaders of society and so on. It's associated with the rise of Darwinism to a very large extent because people interpreted that to mean that all important traits are genetic and that you can, in the same way that you can make short-legged sheep with a lot of fur, you can make superior people that will be the ones that actually deserve to share in the good things of the world. I'm putting it kind of crudely, but I think that there is a creepy kind of alien, techie kind of otherness to a lot of the thinking that is influential now.
Where does Marilynne Robinson stand on AI and the control of it, the ownership of it, the financing of it, the relation to humanistic studies and learning?
People ask me, it sounds terrible to me, frankly. I mean, it's a hash that's made out of a great pool of undifferentiated language that is perhaps not of the highest quality or, reputable insight or anything. I myself think it is a boondoggle. I think it's basically a fraud. For one reason, because it's not reliable at the level that it ought to be in order to assume the importance that is apparently being imagined for it. Mm-hmm. Also, I think that things get pumped up, like this is the great breakthrough, and therefore billions of dollars flow into it. And then all kinds of difficulties emerge from it, and that people don't want to lose what they've invested, so they put more billions into it, and there's more press about that and all the rest of it, how it's looming. And I mean, it's going to run out of the data that it needs in the easily foreseeable future. I mean, the best estimate is something like 2040 or something like that. In any case, in the lifetimes of many people alive now, it will have consumed all data that would be available to it. And it cannot reuse data because that makes it hallucinate. It degrades the quality of its product.
We've heard a lot about evangelical Protestant Christian activism thinking in our politics and our culture, but more recently about a sort of conservative Catholicism. J.D. Vance embodies it in a way. I don't quite understand it yet. What do you make of the reactivated conservative Catholic voice in our country?
Well, I don't have a higher opinion of it than Pope Francis had. The thing that Vance said, about you have responsibilities toward the people nearest you and then they sort of fade away as they get farther. That's that elitism that I'm talking about. But it is absolutely not Catholic and not Christian. Those people at the farthest remove are just as sacred as anyone you will ever encounter. You can't say you don't owe them anything. It's ridiculous. And Pope Francis, I think, spent his dying breath saying, no, you've got that wrong, There are kind of do-it-yourself theologies, I think, many of them floating around now, where everything has been rejiggered, so that it flatters certain people and it numbs consciences and all that sort of thing. And that brings us back to the old standard again. We're dealing with images of God. You don't have the right to be slovenly in your ethical posture. That is not a theology. That's an excuse. That's a delusion. That's a blasphemy.
Marilynne Robinson, sum it up in answer to Tracy Cottom's line that she's prepared to die under this American regime. What's the chance, and how would people do it to get this country back?
People are ingenious. People are resourceful. Massive organization would be the crucial thing. I think that we could have huge, peaceful demonstrations. I think that we should be able to find a way to win some elections that matter and be prepared to support and celebrate people who stand up to this until a kind of critical mass of opinion develops around the recovery of America.
Marilynne Robinson, thank you so much for your observations in fiction and in real life, for your teaching, and for this conversation.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Marilynne Robinson won the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction in 2005 for her novel Gilead, first in an epic series about rural life and religious faith in 20th century Iowa. Her account of the second Trump presidency appeared in the New York Review of Books at the end of June. It was titled Notes from an Occupation. Our conversation here at Open Source relies on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, now's the time to go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We're proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to technology to politics to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important now than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. Thank you.